All right, this is stage 4 of our reading of Dr. Chazan's 4th edition of World Prehistory and Archaeology, Pathways Through Time. This is about different perspectives on agriculture and the emergence of villages, talking about the late Neolithic. We already covered the pre-pottery Neolithic A and the pre-pottery Neolithic B. Again, neo meaning new in Latin, also lithic meaning stone, and so we have the new stone. Preferably, most people probably know it as referred to as the Old Stone Age or the New Stone Age, which was coined by an early archaeologist who started the 3-age system. That's before Lewis Benford. Again, at the end of the pre-pottery Neolithic B, there is a sharp reduction in the number of large villages and village sites across most of the Middle East. Of course, some archaeologists argue that the collapse of the early Neolithic settlement system was the result of ecological degradation caused by deforestation. And at the same time that the settlement system collapsed, there were significant changes in technologies and the industries, including the introduction of pottery and in the production of symbolic artifacts. We've already mentioned Göbekli Tepe, and so you might want to go check that out. Concerning the technology, we start to have pottery manufacture that was developed in the Middle East during the late Neolithic, and among the vessels that have been found are small bowls and jars, as well as pots that were used for cooking. There's significant variation in the forms of vessels and in the way that they are decorated in different regions and within different periods. Two of the main methods of decoration were burnishing the clay in order to produce a polished surface and using red pigments in painted designs. All the pots were built by hand, of course, without the use of a potter's wheel, and they were fired at low temperature just because at the time all they had was how hot they could get the fire to be at any given point in time. And so at the same time that pottery was developed, the wide-scale production of plaster was abandoned. Concerning settlement and ritual, the end of the pre-pottery Neolithic saw a decline in the number and size of sites, and by the end of this period, which is often labeled pre-pottery Neolithic C, most of the large sites in Israel, Jordan, Syria, and eastern Turkey were abandoned. The Neolithic in these areas is characterized by a limited number of large sites and small dispersed hamlets. Of course, the large sites differ from those of pre-pottery Neolithic B, and that's the end of the early Neolithic, in that they are not densely packed with structures. The seeming collapse of the pre-pottery Neolithic B settlement system presents a challenge for archaeological interpretation. One possibility is that the collapse was the result of a human-induced ecological crisis. The large populations concentrated in pre-pottery Neolithic B villages, along with their herds of domesticated animals, might have degraded their environments to the point where such population densities could no longer be supported. And of course, one important culprit in this scenario is the large-scale production of plaster, which could have led to extensive deforestation. Of course, that is just a interpretation. Of course, an alternative perspective sees the end of the pre-pottery Neolithic B settlement system not as a collapse, but rather as a shift toward a way of life focused on the grazing of herds of domesticated animals. Again, we've already seen that antelope was high in the area and would migrate to certain areas. So these people were definitely eating a lot of wild game. Of course, the dispersed settlement system found in the late Neolithic site might reflect a population that had shifted to living scattered across the landscape, of course, rather than huddling in large villages. All right, well, we're going to get to one of my favorite sites. It's a Neolithic site in Turkey. As you know, Turkey, the capital of which is Istanbul, used to be the old Constantinople, once was called Byzantium. Of course, the symbolic system of the early Neolithic seems to have collapsed along with the settlement system by the time of the late Neolithic. Among the most striking symbolic artifacts of the late Neolithic are small figurines that tend to be of stylized humans rather than that of animals. And skull removal and ornamentation, however, is not found on these late Neolithic sites as they are in early Neolithic sites. Of course, in central and western Turkey, there is a continuity in dense village settlement through the late Neolithic. I just want to briefly mention that in the last reading, we were talking about how these early Neolithic peoples were literally, they would find the skulls bashed, the skeletons laid in a prone position, and whatever the case was, it seems to me that the death and the burial, they would bury these individuals underneath the floors of their houses. And it seems like to me that whatever they were doing with these burial rituals, it was surrounded by immense violence. Nevertheless, it is during the late Neolithic period that the settlement of Catalhuk developed on the Konya Plain. This is the one I was speaking of earlier. It's in central Turkey. Excavations at the site have revealed a densely occupied settlement that dates between 9,000 and 8,000 years ago. Of course, we've already covered our chapter on human evolution and the 1 million years of hominins and the different relative species that existed amongst our own. So we're not going to go back into that. But this is pretty much going into the time of, definitely after agriculture had been invented. Obviously, people are still speaking at this time, but language or writing is extant at this point. So the excavations at Catalhuk uncovered a series of rooms which richly decorated with frescoes depicting scenes of leopards, bulls, and goddesses, as well as geometric designs as well. Humans picking up on patterns. So a particularly striking image found in these rooms is that of vultures, and at times depicted circling around headless human figures. Very interesting. For example, we might see a fresco from Catalhuk that depicts a large bull that is surrounded by human figures. The bull being painted in red ochre, most likely. And then, of course, the bull's horns are also found on benches running through the rooms, and human burials were commonly found beneath the benches. Of course, James Mellart, the first excavator of the site, interpreted the decorated rooms at Catalhuk as shrines or temples. Of course, this interpretation is consistent with that of pre-pottery Neolithic P structures from the sites such as Göbekli Tepe and Navali Kuri. However, of course, out of the 139 rooms Mellart excavated, more than 40 were interpreted as shrines. And so it appears that ritual spaces at Catalhuk were widely distributed. Alternatively, however, it could be that the structures that he interpreted as shrines were actually houses, and that ritual and elaborate symbolism were an integral part of daily activity rather than something set apart from that. And so we're comparing these two sites, Göbekli Tepe and Catalhuk. The actual interpretation of the symbolism found at Catalhuk has provided rich grounds for speculation. The discovery of a significant number of goddess figurines at the site has drawn the attention of archaeologists who argue that Neolithic society was focused on a goddess cult. And so this culture has attracted the attention of Ian Hodder. And if you remember, Ian Hodder was the one who developed the post-processual archaeology, which is a historical archaeological approach that challenged the new archaeology of Lewis Benford. The processual archaeology of Lewis Benford, and this would be post-processual archaeology. But anyways, this Catalhuk has also attracted the attention of Ian Hodder, who I just spoke of, who has reopened excavations on the site in order to gain a broader contextual understanding of the ritual activity and the symbolism. All right, so contextual is going to be a very important word as we go throughout this. And so domestication. At domestication during the late Neolithic, there is a continuous decline in the role of hunting for subsistence. Evidence of the domestication of animals, of course, during the late Neolithic includes changes in the shape of horns in goats. And as we've seen, they had goats domesticated as well as sheep. And a recent study has found that even at Catalhuk, despite the heavy symbolic emphasis on the bulls, the main source of meat for this culture was domesticated goats. Late Neolithic societies also continued to rely on the full range of plants domesticated during the early Neolithic. Assessing the Neolithic Revolution. The evidence from the Middle East demonstrates that there is a great deal of value in Gordon Childs. Remember, he conceptualized the 10 things that distinguish what is a city from a village, and his concept of a Neolithic revolution as well. And so by the end of the pre-pottery Neolithic B, every aspect of life in the Middle East has been transformed as a result of the adoption of a village farming way of life. So, however, the shift to agriculture in the Middle East was not a sudden process, as was predicted, but rather the beginning of the shift dates back to the Natufian period. Remember, we talked about the Natufian period with the construction of small settlements, which then grew during the pre-pottery Neolithic A phase of the early Neolithic. And so when there is evidence of community planning and monumental architecture as well. So the people who lived during this phase of human existence have begun to rely heavily on cereals. Remember, we talked about cereals, but had not domesticated either plants or animals at this time. Plant and animal domestication began in the pre-pottery Neolithic B phase of the early Neolithic, together with an increase in the size and density of the settlements. Pottery was introduced only in the late Neolithic period, when there was a decrease in the size and the density of settlements in much of the region. Of course, the Middle East affords pertinent insights into the reasons for the adoption of agriculture. There is some evidence that the climatic stress of the Younger Dryas, remember the Younger Dryas period we talked about, it corresponds to the end of the Natufian culture and the beginning of the pre-pottery Neolithic A, and how that was a trigger in the development of villages. Of course, most strikingly, agriculture developed as a consequence of people living in villages. And in other words, villages preceded agriculture in the Middle East, at least. So, and then we have the spread of agriculture from the Middle East area of the Mesopotamian region over into Europe. In classical fiction mysteries, all of the clues are exposed, but the pattern stubbornly refuses to emerge. The spread of agriculture from the Middle East is as obvious and elusive as any work of fiction. The facts are clear, however. The origins of European domesticated plants and animals can be traced to the Middle East. There is no evidence of the indigenous domestication of plants and animals. Instead, the spread of the Middle Eastern domesticates can be tracked as they move across Europe in what some archaeologists characterize as a wave of advance. And by 8,500 years ago, domesticated plants and animals had begun to spread into southern or southeastern Europe, and around 7,500 years ago, the farming had spread into Central and Western Europe at that time. And so by 6,000 years ago, but we're talking about 4,000 BCE, people in most of Western Europe, including southern Scandinavia, Britain, and Ireland, were practicing agriculture. The clarity of the pattern has led many archaeologists to claim that a massive movement of populations is the explanation for the spread of agriculture into Europe. Indeed, it would have been a wave of advance. According to this perspective, incoming farmers gradually replaced the hunter-gatherer societies of Europe, and the driving force behind the expansion is thought to be the population increase associated with the farming. Of course, as you know, the Neanderthals were also there with us, fighting along. However, we went up to them, and they died, and we kept going. Of course, one fascinating line of research links the expansion of populations of farmers into Europe with the spread of the Indo-European language family. Of course, Indo-European languages, and we'll cover languages as a part of our World Prehistory reading in Renfrew and Bond's Cambridge World Prehistory in 3 volumes. We'll cover that, more about the language aspect of human society and culture once we get to that reading. But in any case, the driving force behind the expansion is thought to be the population increase associated with farming. Of course, one fascinating line of research links the expansion of populations of farmers into Europe with the spread of the Indo-European language family. Of course, Indo-European languages include all the European Romance languages, such as French, Portuguese, Italian, and Spanish, and the Germanic languages, such as English, German, and Dutch, the Slavic languages as Russian, Polish, and Czech, and Asian languages such as Farsi, Hindi, and Bengali. and several Baltic and Balkan languages such as Latvian, Lithuanian, and Albanian, and a number of more dispersed languages such as Sanskrit and the ancient language Hittite, spoken in the area that is now Turkey. Of course, the written language obviously is yet to be deciphered. But the language dispersal hypothesis, which is the theory that the spread of agriculture across Europe was the result of the migration of farmers who spoke Indo-European languages. And so this, again, is come to be known, which views the spread of agriculture as the movement of people carrying with them an entire way of life, including farming, religion, and language. This is called the language dispersal hypothesis. The language dispersal hypothesis is a bold concept reminiscent of the out of Africa hypothesis, which is discussed earlier in our the last reading, the last chapter actually, when we talked about how all the humans originally have been from southern eastern Africa, migrating to the Eurasian landmass, and of course some towards the west, some towards the east, those going down to Java and Australia, the peopling of Australia, the peopling of the Americas, and then it keeps on going from there. However, farming is linked with the people and the language. The spread of agriculture into Europe involves the replacement of hunter-gatherers by farmers, and in this model, the hunter-gatherers emerge as passive, and they are defenseless in the face of the gradual wave of advancing farmers. Of course, however, there is increasing evidence that the millennia leading up to the shift to agriculture saw dramatic shifts in European hunter-gatherer societies that preceded the arrival of farming. We obviously have to take the weather and the climate into consideration as well. And of course, these societies collectively labeled as Mesolithic or Mesolithic. In the geological timescale, you have the not the Paleolithic, but you have the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic and the Cenozoic, or Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. And just so how in archaeology and history we study these societies, and this one's collectively labeled as Mesolithic or Middle Stone, which practiced a broad spectrum adaptation similar to that found in the Tufian of the Middle East. Of course, in the Mesolithic levels of the Franchiti cave in Greece, which occupied around 11,000 years ago, there's evidence that the occupants hunted red deer, cattle, and pigs. They also collected land snails and shellfish. Wild plants, including pistachios, almonds, pears, and wild oats, wild barley were also collected, and there is also evidence of long-distance sea travel. Obsidian was brought to the site from the island of Milos, which is a 100-kilometer sea voyage from the mainland. Milos, as you will find, has a distinct history in the Greek world of classical antiquity. And so tuna are also found in large quantities, indicating offshore fishing in these Mesolithic societies. Paleo-environmental studies. So remember, paleo meaning old, just studying the environment of the old prehistoric past. It studies along the coast of England, producing strong evidence that Mesolithic hunter-gatherers used fire in order to shape their landscape. Charcoal is ubiquitous in sediment profiles dating to the period of Mesolithic occupation. The prevalence of charcoal cannot be explained on the basis of natural phenomena such as lightning strikes, but similar use of fire by the Australian hunter-gatherers is known as fire stick farming. Burning would have increased the fodder available to wild animals, which could then be hunted, and would also have increased the availability of wild plants for collecting. The evidence of burning, I guess you could call it slash burning, by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in England muddies the clarity of the division between hunter-gatherers and farmers. Of course, clearly the hunter-gatherers in what is now England were capable of actively manipulating aspects of their environment. Of course, the most impressive Mesolithic site is Lipinski Vir, which is located next to a whirlpool in the Iron Gates gorges of the Danube River in Serbia. Lipinski Vir consists of a series of trapezoid-shaped structures associated with a large number of burials and sculptures that mix human and fish attributes. Untangling the relationship among the sculptures, the burials, and other household features such as hearths remain a major challenge. The Danube River would have been a rich source of fish, particularly sturgeon, and it is not surprising that the faunal remains from the earliest levels are domesticated by fish bones, or dominated by fish bones. In the final stages of the occupation, there appears to have been a shift to increased reliance on hunting deer. The dates for the occupation of Lipinski Vir range from between 8,400 and 7,600 years ago. Of course, this is by the Danube River in Serbia. And of course, many people think that these dates overlap with the time of the arrival of Neolithic agriculturalists, indicating that in the latter phase of the village, the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Lipinski Vir lived alongside farming communities, and domesticated plants and animals spread into Europe from the Middle East. Of course, however, there is little doubt that the Mesolithic societies were capable of adopting these plants and animals into their broad spectrum adaptations. Genetic studies, of course, as we have talked about earlier, in the Other World Prehistory book, and studies of skeletal remains found on European archaeological sites indicate that the spread of agriculture into Europe involved the influx of new populations, but also that there was not a simple replacement of Neolithic hunter-gatherers. Analysis of Mesolithic hunter-gatherer skeletons show a dominance of a single line of descent known as haplogroup U. Haplogroup U is present among European Neolithic samples, but is found in lower frequency, while another line of descent known as haplogroup H is dominant. Haplogroup H is completely absent from the Mesolithic sample, and these data indicate the influx of a new population with the onset of the Neolithic, and as indicated by the appearance of haplogroup H that did not completely replace the Mesolithic population, as indicated by the persistence of haplogroup U. The farming communities that emerged around 7,200 years ago in the Central and Western Europe are known as the linear band ceramic, or LBK culture. The LBK societies cultivated Middle Eastern plants and herded Middle Eastern animals, but they lived in communities unlike any found in the Middle East. Again, this is Central and Western Europe. And of course, the houses reached up to 30 meters in length. These houses are evidence of far more than simply changes in technology or construction. The large size of these houses must reflect the nature of the households that lived in them, suggesting that during the linear band ceramic period, extended kinship groups, and it also include these times where these extended kinship groups lived together. Of course, wooden lined wells are a striking feature found at a number of these linear band ceramic sites. At Alscherbitz in Germany, it is possible to use 3D laser scanning, for example, of individual worked planks in order to reconstruct the complex carpentry that was involved in building the well lining. And at the bottom of the Alscherbitz well shown, there are extraordinary preservation of plant remains, including einkorn and emmer wheat, peas, lentils, and linseed, which was used for oil. Of course, there were also wild fruits, including strawberries, apples, and raspberries, hazelnuts, along with black henbane, which is a strong hallucinogenic. Excavations on the linear band ceramic sites have produced graphic evidence of warfare that resulted in mass killings, suggesting that this new agricultural way of life included a high level of violence as well. At Talheim in southern Germany, a large pit was found with the remains of 11 men, 7 women, and 16 children. Blows to the head had killed 20 of these people, and 2 adults had been shot in the head by arrows. At Schöneck, Kilianstatten, also in Germany, the bodies of 26 individuals were found in a trench in the middle of the village. The skeletons show evidence of blunt force trauma to the head and arrow injuries. Of course, young females were absent, perhaps indicating that these members of the community were abducted. But there is also evidence that the victims' legs were broken in acts of systematic torture or mutilation. In September of 1991 CE, 2 hikers discovered a corpse stuck in the ice in the Alps near the Austrian-Italian border. Subsequent investigation showed that their find was no ordinary corpse. It was the mummified remains of a man who had died on this spot near the end of the Neolithic period, slightly over 5,000 years ago. His body and clothing had been preserved under the ice, providing a unique perspective on the aspect of Neolithic culture that are rarely preserved. He wore a cap, a shirt, and leggings made of fur, a loincloth and shoes made of leather, and a grass cloak. He carried a bag with embers to start fires, as well as what are apparently medicinal plants, probably for wounds, I would say. Certain plants, like mushrooms, help to stop infections because of their bacteria. Of course, his gear included a retoucher to prepare his flint tools that he needed, and as his skin also bears tattoos on his wrist, spine, knee, calf, foot, and ankle. And this is called, he is called, obviously, Otzi the Iceman, as he became known to be, and he has been the subject of what is perhaps the most detailed study of any human body that has ever been received, the most well-preserved prehistoric man. And not even the first single fingernail that survived has escaped scrutiny. Analysis of the fingernail found evidence of periods of stress in the months before the Iceman died. Sequencing his DNA shows that he was lactose intolerant. So he had a dagger with him, and of course, yet as the details build up, an air of mystery still surrounds the Iceman. Who was he, and why was he up in the mountains? Was he a shepherd, a shaman, an outcast? There are many clues, but no clear answers. We do know, however, that he experienced violence immediately before his death. An arrowhead was found lodged in his left shoulder, and he appears to have incurred a deep slash wound to one of his hands a few days before he died. One possibility is that he fled to the mountains in order to escape an attack on his village, perhaps an attack like the event that produced the mass graves at Telheim and Schoneck, Kilianstatten. So, when we look at the LBK culture, which LBK culture was the linear band ceramic culture, there is highly uniformity across its entire distribution and appears to have spread across Europe very rapidly. Those who view agriculture as the expansion of populations point to these features and argue that the LBK culture is best explained as the result of people moving with their way of life. However, the novelty of this community structure suggests that it represents a local innovation, rather than an idea that came with new groups of people. Of course, this new way of life also appears to have brought with it an intensification of warfare and also that of violence. So to sum up, we're saying that there is no evidence for the domestication of plants or animals during the Kabaran and geometric Kabaran periods, which we've discussed before. Excavation of the waterlogged site at Ohallo in the Sea of Galilee has revealed the remains of a series of brush huts. The characteristic stone tool of the Natufian period is the lunate, which is a small crescent-shaped blazet. Of course, some lunates have sickle polish. Other characteristic Natufian artifacts include decorated ground stone artifacts and shell beads. Natufian sites include the remains of circular, stone-built structures and burials. Of course, this is before we've had structures that were built in a rectangular shape. There is no evidence of the domestication of plants from the Natufian period. Dogs were the only animal domesticated during the period. Of course, we saw the transition from round huts to rectangular houses because of the larger land and the larger populations needed to have these huts or houses closer together and in square form in order to provide more space for their populations. As we move into the village section of our study. Of course, there's no evidence of the domestication of plants from the Natufian period. Dogs, however, were the only animal that was domesticated during the period of the Natufian. During the early Neolithic, large settled villages developed. Some of these sites show evidence of large communal structures, such as the tower at Jericho and the semi-subterranean buildings at Jerf el Amar that we discussed. Concerning dog domestication, it seems like dogs were first domesticated between 16,000 and 12,000 years ago. Of course, numerous ritual objects, including plastered human skulls, are found on early Neolithic sites. Plant domestication developed sometime in the early Neolithic during the pre-pottery Neolithic B period. And of course, this is the second half of the early Neolithic. And among the plants domesticated were wheat, barley, lentils, peas, and chickpeas as well. The domestication of sheep and goats developed during the early Neolithic after the domestication of plants. The earliest pottery is found in the late Neolithic, and there was a reduction in the number of large village sites across much of the Middle East during the late Neolithic. Of course, that's why we find the earliest pottery finds in the late Neolithic, indicating that the transition from pre-pottery to pottery. And in contrast to the general pattern, the site of Catalhuk in Turkey has developed into a major center during the late Neolithic period. The origin of agriculture in Europe is based on the adoption of Middle Eastern domesticated plants and animals. The distinctive site structure of the linear band ceramic, again, it is LBK for short, the distinctive site structure of this early agricultural village and suggests a shift not only in technology but also in social structure as well. And there is significant evidence for violence and warfare found on these sites. We might want to ask the questions: can the development of agriculture in the Middle East be described as a Neolithic revolution? In what ways does the Natufian period differ from the preceding Kabaran and geometric Kabaran periods? What is the evidence and significance of ritual behavior during the early Neolithic? And what are the opposing views of how agriculture came to be adopted in Europe? And why is this certain LBK significant to this debate?